I thought I took a humiliating job to survive my divorce. But on night one in that coastal mansion, the man his family called insane looked right at me. "I know what he did," he whispered. A secret only my ex-husband knew. The shock was realizing the only lunatic here was completely sane. Fleeing meant losing my income. Staying meant risking my life, my daughter, and my final chance to take back everything stolen from me. My name is Kylie Barnes. I am 36 years old, and up until 6 months ago, my life made perfect, predictable sense. I spent my days as a senior risk review specialist at Northline Risk Systems. My entire professional identity was built on identifying vulnerabilities, calculating variables, and protecting corporate assets from unforeseen catastrophic loss. I drafted contingency plans for a living. Yet, I entirely failed to predict the total, devastating collapse of my own existence. My husband, Daniel Mercer, did not just leave me after 11 years of marriage. He executed a hostile and systematic takeover of my reality. He did not simply pack a suitcase, stand in the hallway, and confess to a passionate affair in the middle of the night. That kind of cliché exit would require a shred of human conscience. Instead, Daniel spent months meticulously preparing his departure while smiling at me over the dinner table, asking about my day, and kissing my forehead before bed. By the time he actually handed me the divorce papers, the trap had already sprung. Our joint savings accounts were completely drained. He had masterfully funneled our liquid assets into untouchable offshore entities and phantom business investments that my lawyer could not immediately trace. Worse, he had weaponized my pristine credit score, the massive loan for the kitchen renovation we never started, the maxed-out credit cards for his supposedly vital corporate retreats, the unexpected tax liabilities. They were all legally strapped to my name. He left me holding a massive anchor of debt while he swam effortlessly toward a luxury yacht. The descent into poverty was brutally fast. Within 4 weeks of his departure, I was forced to pack up our beautiful, sunlit townhouse in Providence. I remember standing in the empty living room, the sharp echo of packing tape tearing off cardboard boxes sounding exactly like bones snapping under pressure. I had to pull my 8-year-old daughter, Lena, out of the only home she had ever known. We dragged our suitcases across the state line to my mother's cramped, drafty house in Warwick, sleeping on a sagging twin mattress in my childhood bedroom, listening to Lena cry softly in the dark because she missed her colorful bedroom and her neighborhood friends. I felt a kind of toxic shame that burned the air right out of my lungs. I was a professional risk manager who had been left with absolutely zero leverage and nothing to protect her own child. Then came the public humiliation. Daniel did not even have the decency to hide his new, upgraded life. He immediately stepped into the Rhode Island elite social spotlight with Vivian Vale. Vivian was not just a younger, prettier woman. She was an acquisition, a weapon of mass destruction aimed directly at my self-esteem. Wealthy, razor-sharp, and terrifyingly composed, Vivian was a titan in local philanthropy and a major player in biomedical technology investments. Seeing their glossy pictures plastered across local society pages made me physically sick. Daniel stood beside her in bespoke suits I had ironed the foundation for, looking like a man who had finally claimed his rightful throne. That was the deepest, most agonizing wound of all. It was not the loss of his love, because clearly, there was none left to mourn. It was the sudden, suffocating realization that he had never actually valued me as a human being. To Daniel, I was never a partner. I was scaffolding. I was the reliable, hard-working, blind foundation he stood on just long enough to reach the next floor up. The moment he grasped Vivian's golden hand, he kicked the scaffolding away without bothering to look down to see where I smashed into the concrete. My new reality became a suffocating cycle of final notices and past due warnings. I needed thousands of dollars just to keep my divorce attorney answering my desperate phone calls. My lawyer had been brutally honest during our last brief conversation. "Kylie, if you do not produce a retainer by Friday, I have to withdraw as your counsel," she had warned me. Daniel has a legal team that will bury you under paperwork until you agree to walk away with nothing. I had hung up the phone and cried until my ribs ached. I was terrified of losing Lena's spot at her magnet school, a place that provided the only shred of routine and stability she had left. On top of that, the bank was threatening immediate legal action over the 2 defaulted loans Daniel had pinned on me. Every time my phone rang, my chest seized with panic. I applied for dozens of corporate jobs, but the market was frozen, and the gap on my resume from when I scaled back my hours to raise Lena made me invisible to corporate recruiters. I was drowning, swallowing dirty water with every breath. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday when I found the listing. I was scrolling through an obscure private employment board, my eyes burning from exhaustion and unshed tears. The advertisement was sparse, completely devoid of corporate branding or cheerful human resources jargon. It simply demanded a live-in caretaker for a mentally unstable adult male at an isolated private estate. The requirements were rigid and bizarre absolute discretion, a mandatory non-disclosure agreement, and an immediate start date. There were no medical credentials required, only an ironclad promise to keep the doors locked and the mouth shut. But it was the salary that made my heart stop beating. The monthly compensation was staggering. It was more than I had made in half a year at Northline Risk Systems. I sat in the dark, the harsh blue light of the laptop screen illuminating the peeling floral wallpaper of my childhood bedroom. The rationale, risk-assessing part of my brain screamed that this was incredibly dangerous. Legitimate jobs do not pay a massive premium for absolute silence. They do not demand you sever ties with the outside world to babysit a volatile stranger in a coastal fortress. But desperation is a phenomenal silencer of logic. I did the brutal math in my head. 1 month of that salary would clear the immediate threat of a bank lawsuit. 2 months would secure Lena's tuition for the entire year and pay my lawyer enough to genuinely fight Daniel for a fair financial settlement. 3 months, and I could afford a security deposit on a safe, clean apartment for me and my daughter. "It is only temporary," I whispered to the empty room, glancing at the small lump under the blankets where my daughter slept. "Just a few months, just until we survive this." I told myself I could endure anything for 90 days. It was just a job, a temporary, bizarre detour to survive the absolute worst chapter of my life. I did not care if the man screamed at the walls, threw his meals on the floor, or paced the halls all night. I just needed the money to rebuild the fortress Daniel had burned down. I typed out a brief, clinical response, attaching a resume that heavily highlighted my discretion, extreme attention to detail, and crisis management skills. I pressed the send button before I could talk myself out of it. I thought I was simply taking a humiliating, desperate job to crawl out of the financial grave my ex-husband had dug for me. I had absolutely no idea that I was walking straight into a nightmare far more twisted than the one I was trying to escape, or that the stone mansion on the edge of the ocean would become the brutal battleground where I would finally learn how to destroy the man who broke me. The drive down the winding coastal roads of Narragansett felt like descending into a completely different reality. The vibrant, bustling energy of the city faded away, replaced by twisted oak trees and jagged, gray cliffs plunging violently into the Atlantic Ocean. When the massive iron gates of Ashmore Point Estate finally loomed into view, my hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. The mansion was not built to welcome guests. It was constructed of imposing, cold gray stone, perched precariously on the edge of a precipice, staring down at the churning water below. It looked less like a home and more like a high-security vault meant to keep the outside world out. Or perhaps, to keep someone locked securely inside. I parked my battered sedan near the garages, feeling entirely out of place next to the gleaming, imported European luxury vehicles lining the pristine driveway. The wind whipped off the water, biting sharply through my thin coat. I walked up the wide stone steps, every footfall echoing against the heavy timber of the front doors. Before I could even reach out to grasp the heavy brass knocker, the door swung inward silently. Vivian Vale waited in the expansive marble foyer. She was a masterclass in calculated intimidation. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored cream silk suit, she possessed a sharp, striking beauty that felt exactly as cold as the marble beneath our feet. Her posture was rigidly perfect. She did not offer a handshake or a polite smile of greeting. She merely looked at me, her pale eyes dissecting my cheap clothes and the heavy bags under my eyes, clearly registering my sheer desperation as a highly usable asset. "You are remarkably punctual," Vivian stated. Her voice was terrifyingly soft, a velvet ribbon wrapping tightly around a steel wire. Every syllable felt rehearsed, engineered to command absolute obedience without her ever needing to raise her volume. "Follow me. We have much to cover before you take your post." I followed her through the echoing, cavernous hallways. The estate was suffocating in its absolute luxury. Antique tapestries absorbed the sound of our footsteps, and the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and expensive, sterile cleaning agents. It felt like walking through a mausoleum where nothing was allowed to live, breathe, or step out of place. Vivian led me into a stark, minimalist office overlooking the manicured gardens. She sat behind a massive glass desk and gestured for me to take the single, uncomfortably stiff chair opposite her. She folded her manicured hands, the large diamonds on her fingers catching the weak afternoon light piercing through the blinds. "You are here to manage my brother-in-law, Adrian Vale," Vivian began, her tone strictly clinical and devoid of any familial warmth. "He is 44 years old. The financial press portrays him as the brilliant founder of Vale Meridian, currently taking an extended sabbatical. The reality is far less dignified. Following a severe yachting accident last year, he suffered a catastrophic traumatic brain injury. The brilliant man he once was no longer exists." She unlocked a heavy desk drawer and retrieved a thick, black leather-bound ledger, sliding it across the smooth glass toward me. "He is profoundly unstable," Vivian continued, her pale, unblinking eyes locking onto mine. "He suffers from extreme paranoia, severe delusions, and he has a heavily documented tendency toward violent, explosive outbursts. You are not a nurse, and you are not a therapist. You are a containment protocol. Your sole job is to keep him safe from himself and to ensure the household runs without the slightest disruption." I nodded slowly, keeping my face entirely blank, treating her exactly like any difficult corporate stakeholder I used to manage in my previous life. "The rules are absolute," Vivian commanded, leaning forward a fraction of an inch. "Adrian is completely forbidden from accessing any telephone, computer, or television. He is to have zero contact with the outside world. Any mail that arrives bearing his name comes directly to my office. Above all else, you will administer his medication exactly according to the strict schedule provided by his private physician. Every single dose must be recorded in this black ledger with your signature and the exact time of administration. A minute late is grounds for immediate termination without pay." As she spoke, my old instincts, the deeply ingrained habits that made me a top-tier risk assessor, began firing rapidly. I started scanning the room, not as a desperate woman needing a paycheck to survive, but as a professional evaluating structural vulnerabilities and control systems. I noticed the sleek, black dome camera mounted discreetly in the corner of the high ceiling. It was silently panning, its highly advanced lens sweeping the entire room. When Vivian escorted me back into the main hallway to head toward the east wing, my eyes kept moving upward, tracking the angles. There was another camera mounted above the grand staircase. Two more crisscrossed the long, echoing corridor. Another watched the heavy steel doors of the service elevator. It was a massive, casino-grade surveillance network. The narrative Vivian was spinning simply did not align with the physical infrastructure of the house. If you have a patient who occasionally throws a violent tantrum, you might put a camera in his room and perhaps the hallway directly outside it. You do not wire the entire estate with pan and tilt optical zoom lenses covering every conceivable blind spot. This system was not designed to monitor a madman wandering the halls. It was designed to actively monitor the staff. It was a dense, inescapable net woven specifically to catch anyone who stepped out of line. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was knowingly walking into a remarkably well-funded cage. A hulking security guard in a dark, tailored suit stood outside a heavy oak door at the far end of the east wing. He unlocked the deadbolt with a heavy metallic clack and stepped aside without making eye contact. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped into Adrian Vale's private quarters. The suite was massive, dominated entirely by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying, terrifying view of the jagged cliffs and the violent ocean crashing below. The air inside felt deeply stagnant, heavy with a suffocating, unbearable tension. Sitting in a high-backed leather chair facing the glass was the man I had been hired to control. Adrian Vale looked absolutely nothing like the polished, aggressively confident titan of industry I had read about during my frantic late-night research. He was a hollowed-out shell. His frame was incredibly gaunt. His shoulders slumped underneath a dark gray cashmere sweater that hung loosely on his diminished body. A heavy, dark shadow of coarse stubble covered his sharp jaw, and his eyes were sunken deep into his skull. Ringed with bruised, purple exhaustion, he sat perfectly motionless, staring out at the churning gray water as if he had entirely given up on the world operating behind his back. On a small, polished wood table beside his chair sat a silver tray holding a delicate porcelain teapot and a matching, fragile cup. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing myself to steady my racing pulse. "Good afternoon, Mr. Vale," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and authoritative. "I am your new caretaker." For a long, agonizing moment, he did not move a single muscle. He did not even blink. Then, with a speed and ferocity that completely defied his frail appearance, his arm lashed out, his hand slammed into the silver tray with a violent, deafening crash. The heavy tray flew off the small table. The porcelain teapot shattered against the expensive hardwood floor, sending a spray of scalding brown liquid across the intricate antique rug. "Get out!" Adrian roared, twisting violently in his heavy chair to face me. His voice was raw, grating, and full of unhinged, terrifying fury. His dark eyes were wide and wild, snapping with a dangerous, unpredictable energy. "Get out of this room before I tear you apart. Leave." I froze entirely, every muscle in my body tensing in preparation for a physical assault. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped, panicked bird. He was exactly the terrifying monster Vivian had just described to me in her pristine office. But then, something incredibly subtle and deeply wrong happened. A tiny, almost imperceptible mechanical whir sounded from high above us, up in the dark corner of the ceiling. The small red light of a high-definition security camera blinked on, signaling it was now actively recording the room. The physical transformation was instantaneous. It was exactly like watching a heavy iron switch being forcefully flipped off inside his brain. Adrian's wild, furious expression completely evaporated into thin air. His tense jaw slacked. The violent, kinetic energy drained from his posture in a fraction of a second. He slumped heavily back into the leather chair, turned his face sharply away from me, and resumed his blank, empty stare out the massive window. The highly dangerous lunatic was entirely gone, instantly replaced by a docile, broken, heavily medicated invalid. I stood completely frozen amidst the shattered porcelain and the sharp smell of spilled Earl Grey tea, my analytical mind racing frantically to process what I had just witnessed. That was not a genuine, uncontrollable psychotic break. That was a calculated performance. He had reacted specifically to the red light turning on. I slowly backed away, my shoes crunching softly on the broken, jagged china. I reached blindly behind me, my hand finally finding the heavy brass handle of the door. I pulled it open, incredibly desperate to escape the suffocating, paranoid atmosphere of the suite. Just as I pivoted my body to step out into the heavily monitored hallway, the absolute silence of the room shattered one final time. The voice was completely different now. It was entirely stripped of all the manic gravel and raging madness he had projected seconds earlier. It was impossibly quiet, incredibly sharp, and chillingly, undeniably sane. "Do not believe what they call madness," Adrian whispered, his dark eyes remaining rigidly locked on the churning ocean outside the thick glass. "Count the pills." The relentless rhythm of the Atlantic Ocean crashing against the jagged rocks below my bedroom window made sleep entirely impossible. I lay perfectly still on the stiff, overly starched sheets of the staff quarters, staring up at the dark ceiling. It was my very first night at Ashmore Point, and the entire estate felt fundamentally wrong. Despite the sheer size of the mansion, the silence inside the stone walls was not peaceful. It was an aggressive, suffocating quiet, the kind of heavy stillness that usually precedes a violent storm. Every instinct I had honed over years of analyzing corporate risk was screaming that the foundation of this household was fundamentally rotten. The digital clock on the bedside table cast a harsh red glow across the dark room. It was nearly 1 a.m. I threw off the heavy duvet, my skin prickling with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I slipped into my robe and tied the belt tight, needing to walk off the suffocating anxiety. As I opened my door and stepped out into the shadowed hallway, a sound drifted up from the lower levels. I froze, my hands still gripping the brass doorknob. It was faint, muffled by the thick walls and heavy tapestries, but it was unmistakable. Someone was playing the piano. My brow furrowed in deep confusion. During my exhaustive orientation, Vivian had explicitly stated that the ground floor glass conservatory was strictly off-limits. She claimed the open space and the reflective glass triggered severe sensory overload and violent agitation in her brother-in-law. The night staff was supposed to have locked that wing down completely. I moved silently down the grand staircase, keeping my back pressed close to the dark oak paneling to avoid the direct line of sight of the overhead security cameras. The music grew clearer with every step. It was not the random, chaotic banging of a fractured mind. It was a fiercely complex classical piece, played with terrifying precision and deep, haunting emotion. The notes cascaded through the cold air, fast and demanding, requiring absolute focus and fine motor control. I reached the heavy arched doorway of the conservatory and peered through the glass panes. The room was bathed in the pale, icy light of the full moon filtering through the massive skylights. Sitting on the leather bench before a black grand piano was Adrian Vale. He was completely transformed. The hollowed-out, trembling invalid from the afternoon was gone. His back was rigidly straight, his shoulders pulled back with undeniable authority. His hands swept across the black and white keys with a fluid, commanding grace that was mesmerizing. There was no hesitation, no blank staring, no tremors. He was entirely anchored in reality, his mind navigating the intricate architecture of the music with absolute, undeniable sanity. I stood there, scarcely daring to breathe, watching the supposed madman play with the clarity of a virtuoso. The sheer cognitive function required to execute a piece of that magnitude completely destroyed Vivian's narrative of his catastrophic brain injury. Suddenly, the music stopped. His hands hovered over the keys for a fraction of a second before dropping to his lap. The heavy silence slammed back into the room. He did not turn his head. He did not look over his shoulder. He simply stared straight at the polished wood of the piano and spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm, sharp, and chillingly clear. "Does Daniel still call you Kai?" My heart completely stopped. The air vanished from my lungs. My hands went numb, gripping the cold stone frame of the doorway so hard my fingers ached. Kai. It was a private, intimate nickname. Daniel had only ever used it behind closed doors, whispered in the dark during the early, seemingly happy years of our marriage. It was not on my resume. It was not in any public record. It was a ghost of a life that no longer existed, spoken by a man I had met only hours ago. I stepped into the moonlit room, my legs feeling like lead. "How do you know that name?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mixture of raw fear and rising anger. Adrian slowly turned around on the piano bench. The bruised exhaustion around his eyes remained, but the eyes themselves were sharp, calculating, and dangerously intelligent. He told me, Adrian replied smoothly, his tone entirely conversational. Daniel has been coming to this house for months, long before your divorce was finalized, long before you even knew he had hired a lawyer. The floor felt as though it were dropping out from underneath me. Daniel does not know you. He works for your sister-in-law. He works for whoever signs the checks, Adrian countered, his gaze locking onto mine. And Vivian signs very large checks. My sister-in-law required a specific type of containment strategy to keep me locked in this house, and your ex-husband is a very skilled strategist. I shook my head, my mind rejecting the horrifying puzzle pieces sliding into place. I applied for a blind listing. It was a coincidence. There are absolutely no coincidences in this house, Kylie, Adrian said softly, leaning forward slightly. You were heavily vetted and explicitly chosen. Daniel pitched you to Vivian as the perfect candidate. He knew exactly how broke you were. He knew you were drowning in the debt he strategically dumped on you. He told Vivian that you were a woman desperate enough to endure anything for a paycheck. And more importantly, ruined enough that if you ever tried to blow the whistle on what is happening in this estate, no judge or journalist would believe a bitter bankrupt, discarded ex-wife. Bile rose in the back of my throat. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was paralyzing. Daniel had not just abandoned me. He had actively orchestrated my placement in this nightmare. He had weaponized my financial ruin to turn me into a compliant warden for a corporate prisoner. I was not hired for my discretion. I was hired because I was easily disposable. Why are you telling me this? I whispered, my voice thick with shock. Adrian stood up, taking a slow step toward me. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his face. Because you need to understand the game you are actually playing. You think you are here to nurse a madman. You are actually here to guard a hostage. And if you do not wake up quickly, they will destroy you just as thoroughly as they are trying to destroy me. Before I could process the massive weight of his confession, a harsh metallic sound echoed from the far end of the hallway. The heavy rhythmic thud of combat boots slapping against the hardwood floors was approaching rapidly. The night security patrol was coming. The shift in Adrian was instantaneous and terrifying. The calculating intelligence vanished from his eyes, replaced by a wild, feral panic. He spun around, his hand shooting out to grab a massive, heavy crystal vase sitting on a marble pedestal near the piano. With a guttural, terrifying roar, he hurled it directly at the thick glass wall of the conservatory. The crystal shattered upon impact, sending a cascade of sharp, glittering shards raining down across the floor. "Get away from me!" Adrian screamed, his voice tearing at his vocal cords. A perfect replication of the violent madness I had witnessed that afternoon. He dropped to his knees, eyed in the middle of the broken glass, clutching the sides of his head and rocking back and forth violently. "The lights. Turn off the red lights. They are burning my skull." Two massive security guards burst through the arched doorway, their heavy flashlights slicing through the darkness, blinding me instantly. "Step back, Miss Barnes," the lead guard bellowed, unholstering a heavy black restraint tie from his belt. "Get away from him now." I stumbled backward, my back hitting the cold glass door, watching in absolute shock as the guards descended upon Adrian. They pinned his arms behind his back, hauling him roughly to his feet as he continued to thrash and scream, playing the part of the broken, deranged patient with terrifying perfection. As they dragged him past me toward the stairs, his head snapped back, for one fraction of a second, through the chaos and the shouting and the blinding beams of the flashlights. His eyes met mine. The screaming stopped for a singular beat. The manic terror vanished. In that fleeting, silent moment, he gave me a look of absolute, chilling lucidity. Then he began to scream again, the sound echoing horribly up the marble staircase as they hauled him back to his cage. I stood alone in the dark conservatory, my bare feet inches away from the shattered crystal. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, but my mind was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. The true horror of my first night at Ashmore Point was not that I was locked in a remote mansion with a violent lunatic. The massive, undeniable shock was realizing that the only man in this entire estate who possessed an ounce of sanity was the one currently being violently restrained on the floor above me. He was entirely sane, and he was faking his madness just to stay alive. The morning sun did nothing to warm the freezing expanse of the main foyer. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy mahogany front doors swung open. I was crossing the marble floor, carrying a fresh tray of linens toward the east wing, when I heard the sharp, confident click of leather dress shoes. I stopped dead in my tracks. Daniel stepped into the hall. He looked like he owned the very air he breathed. He wore a bespoke navy suit that draped perfectly across his shoulders, the fabric clearly costing more than what I used to make in 2 months. His hair was perfectly styled, and on his face rested the exact same charming, easy smile that had utterly blinded me for over 10 years. It was the smile he used when he was about to close a massive deal. He did not flinch when his eyes met mine. There was no shock, no momentary hesitation of a man bumping into the ex-wife he had recently bankrupted. He casually handed his cashmere overcoat to a passing maid and strolled directly toward me. He was savoring the moment. He had directed this exact scene, and now he was simply arriving on set to watch the premiere. "Good morning, Kylie," Daniel said smoothly, stopping just a few feet away. His eyes casually raked over my plain, gray staff uniform. "I have to admit, gray really is not your color, but the uniform certainly suits your new station in life." My hands gripped the edges of the linen tray so tightly my joints popped. The sheer audacity of his presence, standing in the heart of the estate where I had just been hired, felt like a physical blow to my chest. "What are you doing here, Daniel?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly low and steady, terrified that a single tremor would give him the satisfaction he craved. "I work here," he replied effortlessly, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "I am the new senior strategic advisor to Vivian Vale." When she mentioned she needed a highly reliable, utterly desperate caretaker who would never dare question authority, I immediately thought of you. I told her you were exceptional at following instructions when you have no other options. The air in the hallway turned to ice. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. My life had not simply drifted into this nightmare by tragic coincidence. I had been deliberately hunted. Daniel and Vivian had woven a suffocating web, and I had walked right into the dead center of it. He had ruined me financially just to manufacture the exact level of desperation required for this job. "You set this up," I whispered, the sickening truth coating my throat. "You destroyed our accounts, so I would have to take whatever scraps you threw my way." "I simply optimized a situation," Daniel corrected, his smile widening into something truly reptilian. "You always were so naive, Kylie. You thought the world rewarded hard work. The world rewards leverage. And right now, I hold all of it." He stepped closer, invading my personal space, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. "Let us be absolutely clear about your reality," he continued, his eyes turning flat and cruel. "You are going to keep your head down. You are going to do exactly what Vivian tells you to do. You will nod. You will serve the meals, and you will sign the logs. If you decide to get suddenly righteous, or if you fail to contain Adrian, you will be terminated, and if you lose this job, you cannot pay your attorney. If you cannot pay your attorney, I will immediately file an emergency motion for full custody of Lena." The mention of my daughter's name from his mouth made my blood run entirely cold. "You do not care about Lena," I shot back, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. "You have not called her in over 8 weeks. I do not need to care about her to use her against you," Daniel stated matter-of-factly. "I will tell the family court that you are unstable, living in poverty, and unfit to provide a stable home. I will tie you up in litigation for the next 5 years until you are broken completely. Do your job, Kylie. Serve the crazy man, collect your little paycheck, and keep your mouth completely shut." He gave me one last, patronizing pat on the shoulder, then walked past me toward Vivian's office. the confident sound of his footsteps fading down the corridor. Months ago, I would have collapsed. I would have dropped the tray, locked myself in a bathroom, and cried until I was physically sick. I would have let the panic consume me. But standing there in the cold marble hallway, something inside me fundamentally shifted. The crushing weight of the humiliation did not shatter me. Instead, it hardened into a dense, dangerous silence. I swallowed the thick, burning bile of my anger. I did not shed a single tear. For the first time since he handed me the divorce papers, I stopped feeling like a victim. I felt like a soldier who had just been handed the map of the enemy's camp. I carried the linens to the East Wing, my mind operating with a terrifying, absolute clarity. I entered Adrian's suite. He was sitting by the window, playing the part of the medicated shell perfectly. I did not speak to him. I knew the cameras were watching every single move I made. I walked directly to the locked cabinet, retrieved the heavy black medical ledger, and sat down at the small desk. I was a risk review specialist. My entire career had been built on finding anomalies in massive stacks of data, tracking fraudulent patterns, and exposing hidden liabilities. Daniel thought he had hired a broken housewife. He had actually hired a seasoned auditor with a massive grudge. I opened the ledger and began to read. I did not just look at the daily required dosages. I started cross-referencing the administration times, the specific chemical compounds, and the physical reactions noted by previous caretakers. I matched the dates in the ledger against the estate visitor log sitting openly on the security desk downstairs. It took me less than 2 hours to find the pattern. It was glaringly obvious to anyone who knew how to look. Adrian's daily baseline medication included standard mood stabilizers and a mild anxiety suppressant. But on very specific days, the dosage of a heavy, highly controversial chemical sedative spiked drastically. The prescribed amount tripled. I tracked the dates of those massive dosage spikes: May 14th, June 2nd, July 18th, August 9th. Every single one of those dates perfectly aligned with the exact days Vivian's private legal team, corporate notaries, or the estate's private physician were scheduled to visit the house. The trap was brilliant in its cruelty. They were not treating a psychiatric condition. They were inducing a chemical lobotomy on demand. Whenever they needed Adrian to appear completely incompetent, incoherent, or incapable of signing legal documents to reclaim his company, they flooded his system with sedatives. They were actively manufacturing his madness to justify maintaining their legal guardianship. I closed the heavy black ledger, my hands perfectly steady. The air in the room felt different now. The thick, suffocating dread from yesterday was entirely gone. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, my perspective had completely inverted. I was no longer an innocent bystander forced into a terrifying caretaking role. I was standing directly inside a massive, highly illegal conspiracy. The medical records in my hands were not health documents. They were forged weapons of corporate theft. And Daniel, the man who had stolen my life, my savings, and my dignity, was the chief architect of this fraudulent prison. He thought he had buried me alive under a mountain of debt and fear. He thought putting me in this house was his ultimate victory. But as I looked at the red light of the security camera blinking silently in the corner, I realized Daniel had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. He had given me direct access to the very evidence that could destroy him. I stood in the sterile light of the ensuite bathroom at exactly 8 o'clock that evening, preparing his nightly medication tray. I decided it was time to run the test. I crushed the heavy blue sedative pill into a fine powder and washed it directly down the brass sink, leaving only the standard daily vitamins and the mild, baseline blood pressure medication in the small paper cup. If Vivian's carefully constructed narrative was true, skipping this massive dose of tranquilizers would send him into a violent, uncontrollable tailspin within hours. If my theory was correct, it would simply give him his brain back. By 10 o'clock, the physical transformation was deeply chilling. I sat in the dim corner of his expansive suite, pretending to read a worn paperback novel, secretly monitoring him over the top of the pages. The severe, persistent tremor in his left hand completely ceased. The cloudy, unfocused glaze that usually coated his dark eyes dissolved entirely, revealing a sharp, piercing intelligence that missed nothing. He did not pace erratically. He did not scream at the walls. Instead, he walked calmly over to the mahogany bookshelf, selected a heavy volume on marine biology, and began to read with absolute, quiet concentration. After an hour of perfect silence, he turned a page and spoke without even looking up from the text. The junior security guard working the front gate yesterday had a noticeable limp in his right leg, and the weekly food delivery truck arrived exactly 12 minutes late. My breath caught sharply in my throat. He was deliberately proving his cognitive retention. He was demonstrating that without the chemical straitjacket flooding his nervous system, his memory was flawless and highly observant. The realization sent a shiver of absolute ice down my spine. The doctors and the lawyers were not treating an illness. They were intentionally poisoning a perfectly healthy man to keep him docile. The following afternoon provided our very first genuine opportunity to speak freely. The daily estate schedule mandated 45 minutes of horticultural exposure in the sprawling western greenhouse. It was a massive, humid glass structure choked with dense ferns, climbing vines, and towering palm trees. I had spent my morning break meticulously mapping the security camera feeds from the main terminal near the staff quarters. The thick overlapping canopy of a massive weeping fig tree created a permanent, impenetrable blind spot for the 2 overhead cameras mounted in the far corner of the glass ceiling. I guided Adrian to a wrought iron bench hidden completely beneath the heavy green leaves. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and blooming orchids, the sound of the ocean completely muffled by the glass walls. "We have exactly 20 minutes before the perimeter patrol rotates," I murmured, keeping my eyes fixed on the gravel path ahead just in case Elias, the groundskeeper, wandered too close. Adrian leaned back against the iron frame. Without the heavy dose of sedatives artificially depressing his central nervous system, his voice lost the raw, grating edge of a madman and settled into a calm, authoritative baritone. "The yacht accident was not an accident," he stated simply, staring intensely at the dirt beneath his boots. "It happened 14 months ago off the coast of Newport." The main halyard snapped in perfectly clear weather. A heavy steel pulley struck the side of my skull. I woke up in a private trauma center 2 weeks later. By the time I regained full consciousness and could articulate a sentence, the legal machinery was already locked perfectly into place. I turned my head slightly to look at him, listening with absolute focus. "Vivian had already petitioned the state court for emergency temporary guardianship," Adrian continued, his jaw tightening so hard the muscles jumped beneath his skin. "She submitted sworn affidavits from hand-picked neurologists declaring me cognitively unstable and completely incapable of managing my own personal or corporate affairs. Every single time I tried to speak to an independent lawyer or demand a new, unbiased medical evaluation, a nurse would come into my room with a fresh syringe. I would wake up 3 days later strapped to a bed, entirely incoherent and raving like a lunatic." I immediately correlated his words with everything I had observed inside the mansion. The sudden violent outbursts, the screaming, the erratic behavior. None of it was a symptom of traumatic brain damage. It was the desperate, terrifying result of a sane man realizing he was being chemically suffocated, lashing out against his captors in pure panic, and every single time he broke down from the sheer terror of it, Vivian used the security footage as fresh, undeniable evidence to legally extend her control over his life. "Why?" I asked softly, the magnitude of the cruelty making my chest ache. "Why go to these extreme lengths? She already possesses immense personal wealth." "It is never just about the money with my sister-in-law," Adrian replied, a bitter, hollow smile touching the corner of his mouth. "It is about absolute, unchecked control." 3 weeks before the mast snapped on that boat, I had finalized the legal paperwork to radically restructure the voting rights within Vale Meridian. I was preparing to officially cut Vivian out of 3 major family trust funds and permanently remove her proxy voting power on the corporate board. She found out. She knew that if I made it to the next quarterly shareholders meeting, her influence would be completely terminated. He shifted his weight on the iron bench, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the humid air feel even heavier. "But Vivian is not a structural engineer," Adrian said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a dangerous edge. "She knows how to quietly bribe a private doctor, but she does not know how to build an airtight system of corporate and legal risk containment. To pull off a theft of this magnitude without triggering a federal investigation, she needed a specialist. She needed someone who understood exactly how to manipulate corporate liability frameworks, insurance protocols, and behavioral documentation." The blood drained completely from my face, leaving my skin icy cold in the sweltering greenhouse. I knew exactly where he was going, but hearing the truth spoken aloud felt like a rusted knife twisting directly into my ribs. "Daniel," I whispered, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. Adrian nodded slowly. "Your ex-husband was brought into the executive inner circle 10 months ago. He sat in on the highly confidential internal meetings regarding the corporation's insurance policies and risk control mechanisms. He designed the exact legal structure that allows Vivian to keep me locked inside this house without triggering an external corporate audit." A sickening wave of nausea washed over me, so strong I had to grip the edge of the iron bench to steady myself. Daniel had not just used his own legal background, he had used my brain. For years. We had sat across from each other at our kitchen table over dinner, and I had talked endlessly about my daily work at Northline Risk Systems. I had explained to him exactly how corporate audits worked, how blind spots in behavioral documentation could be successfully exploited, and how to build compliance systems that looked utterly flawless on paper but were entirely hollow inside. I had essentially handed him the exact blueprint he needed to build this prison. He used my own professional expertise to assist Vivian in stealing a billion-dollar biotech empire. "He used my frameworks," I said, the realization hardening my voice into something cold, metallic, and completely unrecognizable to myself. "The specific documentation style in your medical ledger, the way the staff non-disclosure agreements are layered geographically to prevent cross-communication. It is my exact operational methodology." "He stole your life to build his," Adrian agreed quietly, watching the shift in my posture, "and then he threw you right into the middle of his masterpiece, assuming you were far too broken and terrified to ever notice the architecture of the cage." We sat in the humid silence of the greenhouse for a long, heavy moment. We were two people utterly destroyed by the exact same pair of predators. They had taken Adrian's company, his freedom, and his mind. They had taken my home, my savings, my dignity, and my daughter's security. "So what do we do?" Adrian asked, his gaze searching my face, waiting for my breaking point. I looked at the man the entire world believed was a violent, unpredictable lunatic. I did not see a patient. I saw a brilliant, cornered survivor who had just handed me a loaded weapon. And then I looked down at my own hands resting in my lap. They were no longer shaking. The crushing, suffocating weight of my bitter divorce, the paralyzing fear of impending bankruptcy, the toxic, burning shame of living in my childhood bedroom. It all completely evaporated in the damp heat of the greenhouse. I was no longer the tragic, discarded housewife crying frantically over unpaid legal bills. I was a senior risk review specialist standing directly inside a massive, highly illegal corporate fraud, holding the absolute keys to the entire system. "We create a strict protocol," I said, my voice steady, crisp, and completely devoid of fear. "As soon as we step out from under the leaves of this tree, you are the broken, unpredictable patient. You do not look at me with clarity. You do not speak in complete sentences. If a red light on a camera is blinking, you give them exactly the nightmare they expect to see." "And behind closed doors?" Adrian asked, a dangerous spark finally igniting in his dark eyes. "Behind closed doors," I replied, meeting his gaze with a cold, absolute certainty. "We dismantle them piece by piece, Daniel built this cage using my blueprints, which means I am the only person on this entire estate who knows exactly where the structural weak points are. For the very first time since my entire world collapsed, I felt a dangerous, thrilling sense of sheer power ignite in my chest. Daniel thought he had trapped a desperate, helpless victim in a dark corner. He had absolutely no idea he had just locked the architect directly inside the vault. The investigation began in the absolute dead of night, at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, when the heavy silence of the estate was broken only by the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic outside. I slipped out of my bed. I was no longer just a caretaker. I was a forensic auditor operating behind enemy lines. I carried my personal cell phone, completely muted and dimmed to the lowest brightness, hidden flat against my palm. My first target was the medical supply cabinet in the East Wing. Vivian thought she had implemented a flawless system, but as a risk specialist, I knew that fraud always leaves a paper trail. You just have to know which loose thread to pull. I meticulously photographed the labels on the amber pill bottles, zooming in on the tiny alphanumeric batch codes printed near the expiration dates. I captured the pharmacist's signature, the delivery dates, and the specific milligram dosages. It took me 3 nights of agonizingly slow, silent work to uncover the structural lie. There were 2 completely different sets of records. The heavy black leather binder Vivian had handed me on my first day was nothing but a prop. It was a sanitized, highly curated piece of fiction designed specifically to be legally subpoenaed if a judge or an outside physician ever demanded an audit. The actual truth was locked inside a heavy steel wall safe in the head nurse's private office. I only discovered its existence because I noticed the head nurse wearing a biometric thumb drive around her neck, and the delivery invoices for the medication never matched the inventory physically present in Adrian's suite. They were systematically siphoning industrial-grade sedatives into the house off the official books. I could not crack a biometric safe, but I did not need to. The supply chain anomalies were enough to prove intent. I just needed a witness. I found one in Elias Boone. Elias was the head groundskeeper, a massive, quiet man with hands like weathered leather and a permanent scowl. He had maintained the estate gardens for over 15 years. I noticed him lingering near the glass conservatory whenever I escorted Adrian for his horticultural hours. Elias never made eye contact with the security guards, but his eyes always tracked Adrian with a deep, silent sorrow. On my 5th morning, while pretending to inspect a row of dying orchids, I took a calculated risk. I stepped into the blind spot of the overhead cameras and spoke without turning my head. The potting soil invoices from last month do not match the delivery truck logs at the front gate, I whispered. The trucks are coming in too heavy. They are bringing in medical supplies under the guise of landscaping material. Elias froze. He slowly turned his large frame, his calloused hands gripping a pair of pruning shears tightly. He stared at me for a heavy moment, evaluating whether I was a spy or a savior. You are the 4th caretaker they have hired in 6 months, Elias muttered, his voice a gravelly rumble. The first 3 did not leave because Mr. Vale threw a teacup at them. They left because they started asking questions about the dosage schedules. Anyone who asks a single question gets handed a severance check and a non-disclosure agreement the very next morning. If they push back, Vivian's lawyers threaten to ruin them. I am not asking questions, I replied, my voice hard and flat. I am collecting data. Elias nodded slowly, a grim understanding passing between us. From that moment on, Elias became my invisible courier. He began leaving crumpled delivery manifests and discarded carbon copy receipts hidden inside the empty clay pots in the greenhouse. Those crumpled papers were the key that unlocked the true scope of the nightmare. Late at night, sitting on my bathroom floor with a flashlight, I cross-referenced the vendor names on those hidden receipts using a secure browser on my phone. The companies supplying the off-book sedatives were not pharmaceutical distributors. They were anonymous shell corporations registered in Delaware. I dug deeper, tracing the corporate registration dates. My blood turned to absolute ice. The shell companies were incorporated exactly 8 weeks before Adrian's yacht accident. And the registered agent for every single one of those phantom entities was a boutique financial consulting firm owned directly by Daniel Mercer. This was not a tragic family dispute over medical guardianship. This was a highly orchestrated, premeditated corporate takeover. Daniel and Vivian had plotted to incapacitate Adrian long before the mast ever snapped on that boat. But the most sickening discovery came when I recognized the physical layout of the forged medical intake forms Elias had salvaged from the shredder bin. I stared at the geometric borders, the specific phrasing of the liability waivers, and the unique, customized indemnification clauses printed at the bottom of the page. It was my work. 3 years ago, I had spent 4 months designing a proprietary risk containment framework for Northline Risk Systems. It was a highly specialized document structure meant to shield corporate hospitals from malpractice lawsuits. Daniel had always watched me work late into the night at our kitchen table. He had complimented my brilliance. He had brought me coffee. And then, weeks before he handed me the divorce papers, he had logged into my personal laptop and stolen my entire intellectual property portfolio. He took the exact systems I built to protect people and inverted them to create a legally watertight medical prison for Adrian. He weaponized my own brain against me, leaving me bankrupt while he used my blueprints to execute a billion-dollar fraud. The sheer intimate violation of it made me want to scream until my lungs tore. The next afternoon, inside the humid safety of the greenhouse blind spot, I laid out the financial timeline for Adrian. I expected him to be shocked. Instead, he simply closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the damp glass wall. "They built a perfect machine," Adrian said quietly, "and they financed it with my own company's money." "We have the supply chain evidence," I told him, keeping my voice urgent but controlled. "We have the shell company registrations, but to completely shatter their credibility in front of a judge, I need to know why Vivian targeted your voting rights so aggressively in the first place. What were you going to expose at that board meeting?" Adrian opened his eyes. The sharp, commanding intelligence in his gaze faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a heavy, dark guilt. He looked away from me, staring down at the dirt. "I am not the saint you think I am, Kylie," he said, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper. 5 years ago, Vale Meridian was preparing for a massive public stock offering. Our lead research division made a catastrophic error in a clinical trial protocol. It was not fatal, but it was highly negligent. If the FDA found out, the public offering would have collapsed instantly. Thousands of employees would have lost their pensions. He took a slow, deep breath, the confession clearly tearing at his pride. "I buried it," Adrian admitted, forcing himself to meet my eyes. "I authorized a massive, silent payout. I forced the lead researchers to sign brutal non-disclosure agreements, and I falsified the internal safety reports to protect the stock price. Vivian found the original, unaltered lab data last year. She realized she could use it to completely destroy my reputation and have me federally indicted. When I refused to step down and surrender the company to her, she realized blackmail was not enough. She needed me legally erased. She needed me declared insane so my testimony would be entirely inadmissible if the lab error ever came to light. I stood perfectly still, processing the gravity of his words. The man sitting in front of me had committed corporate fraud. He had actively engaged in a massive cover-up to protect his own empire. He had a dark, deeply compromised moral compass. He was not a helpless, innocent victim wrapped in white linen. He was a ruthless corporate titan who had made a highly illegal, morally bankrupt decision. For a fleeting moment, a cold wave of doubt washed over me. I was risking my freedom, my daughter's safety, and my entire future to save a man who had lied to the federal government. But as I looked at his hollowed-out face, at the severe bruising under his eyes from months of forced chemical sedation, the hesitation vanished. His past sins did not matter. I was not standing beside an angel, and I did not need him to be one. Adrian was not asking me to absolve him of his crimes. He was not asking me to pretend he was a perfect man. He was simply stating a fundamental, undeniable truth No human being, regardless of their past mistakes, deserves to be secretly drugged, systematically driven out of their own mind, and buried alive inside their own body just so someone else can steal the remainder of their life. I thought about Daniel, sitting in his tailored suits, smiling his charismatic smile while he actively destroyed the mother of his child and orchestrated the chemical lobotomy of a business rival. Daniel and Vivian were operating with a level of sociopathic cruelty that eclipsed any corporate cover-up. "I do not care about the clinical trial," I finally said, my voice slicing clearly through the heavy, humid air. "I do not care what you did 5 years ago to protect your stock price. I only care about what they are doing to you right now, and I only care about destroying the man who put us both in this cage." Adrian looked up at me, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his face before settling into a hard, dangerous resolve. He finally understood that I was not a fragile nurse trying to save a patient. I was a weapon, and I was fully loaded. "Then we tear the machine down," Adrian said softly. "Yes," I agreed, a cold, sharp smile touching my lips for the first time in 6 months. "We burn it to the ground, and we make sure Daniel is standing right in the center when the roof collapses." The air inside Ashmore Point grew significantly heavier with every passing day, thickening into a suffocating pressure that made simply drawing a breath feel like a physical chore. The estate was no longer just a cold mansion. It felt like a tightening snare. Daniel was actively watching me. I could feel his gaze tracking my movements across the expansive marble floors, his eyes narrowing slightly whenever our paths crossed in the long, shadowed corridors. He was a predator who had suddenly sensed an undeniable shift in the wind. The broken, weeping woman he had purposefully dumped at this estate was no longer flinching at the heavy sound of his footsteps. My newfound lack of terror was making him deeply uneasy, and an uneasy Daniel was an incredibly dangerous one. He cornered me late on a Tuesday afternoon inside the narrow, windowless butler's pantry. I was standing at the stainless steel counter, meticulously polishing a heavy silver tea service, when he stepped through the doorway and smoothly blocked the only exit. He did not say a word at first. He just stood there, letting the silence stretch into an implicit threat, assessing my posture for any sign of defiance. "You are adapting surprisingly well, Kylie," Daniel finally noted, leaning his shoulder casually against the doorframe. His voice was smooth, carrying that sickening blend of manufactured warmth and underlying menace. "I honestly expected you to break down and quit by day 3. Yet here you are, quietly doing exactly what you are told." I kept my hands moving over the silver teapot, staring intently at the polishing cloth. "I need the paycheck. Daniel, you made absolutely sure of that." He chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope, tossing it casually onto the steel counter next to my tray. "Vivian and I appreciate an employee who understands the value of staying in her own lane," Daniel said, his eyes locking onto the side of my face. "There is $50,000 in that envelope, untraceable cash. Consider it a proactive bonus for your continued excellence in documentation. All you have to do is keep doing exactly what you are doing. Keep noting Adrian's violent instability in the black ledger. Keep the medication flowing smoothly. Do not ask questions about the medical files. And do not pretend you are anything more than a glorified maid." I stared at the thick white envelope. $50,000 was a monumental amount of money. It was a lifeline that could instantly pull me out of the crushing debt he had buried me under. But I knew exactly what it really was. It was a test. If I took it eagerly, he would know I was greedy and corruptible. If I threw it back in his face, he would know I had a spine and was therefore a massive liability. "I cannot accept undocumented compensation, Daniel," I replied softly, keeping my voice thoroughly submissive and laced with manufactured anxiety. If the estate auditors or the medical board ever found out, I could face criminal charges. I just want to do my job and go home to my mother's house. Daniel's easy, charismatic smile vanished instantly. The mask of the generous benefactor dissolved, revealing the absolute cruelty underneath. He pushed off the door frame and took 2 slow steps toward me, invading my personal space until I could smell the expensive bergamot cologne on his collar. "Let us drop the innocent routine," Daniel whispered, his voice turning incredibly harsh and sharp. "You think you can just quietly serve out your time here? Let me remind you of your reality. You are drowning in massive credit defaults. You have 0 assets. You are currently sleeping in a freezing bedroom in Warwick. If you decide to develop a sudden moral complex, or if you screw up this containment protocol in any way, I will not just fire you. I will call my legal team and file an immediate injunction regarding Lena." My hands completely froze on the silver tray. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. A family court judge will see a bankrupt, unstable woman incapable of providing a secure environment. Daniel continued, twisting the psychological knife with practiced precision. "I will take full custody of my daughter. I will drag you through endless psychological evaluations until you are completely bankrupt and exhausted. You will only see Lena on supervised weekends for the rest of her childhood. Do you understand me? You take the money, you log the madness, or you lose your child." I swallowed the burning bile rising rapidly in my throat. I forced my shoulders to slump forward. I let my hands tremble visibly against the cold metal counter. I did not scream. I did not slap his arrogant face. I simply looked down at the floor and delivered the exact performance he demanded. "I understand," I whispered, my voice intentionally breaking. "Please, just leave Lena out of this. I will sign whatever you need." Daniel stared at my bowed head for a long moment, highly satisfied with his work. He picked the envelope back up, tapped it against the counter, and slid it back into his pocket. "Good girl," he sneered, before turning on his heel and walking out of the pantry. But the tightening of the trap was far from over. 2 hours later, Vivian summoned me to the grand study. She sat perfectly upright behind her desk, her face an unreadable mask of absolute control. "Adrian's condition is deteriorating at an unacceptable rate," Vivian announced coldly, not bothering to look up from the legal documents she was signing. "This home environment is clearly no longer sufficient to manage his severe psychotic episodes. I have successfully petitioned the medical board. He is being permanently transferred to a highly secure, private neurological treatment facility in Colorado." The floor felt as though it were dropping out from beneath my feet. "Colorado," I repeated, struggling to keep the sheer panic out of my voice. "The medical transport team will arrive in exactly 48 hours, Vivian confirmed, finally raising her pale, piercing eyes to meet mine. "There will be a final, comprehensive psychiatric evaluation conducted by an independent state board tomorrow morning right here in the main hall. Once they officially sign off on his lack of capacity, he will be sedated and placed on a private plane. You will spend the next 2 days packing his absolute essentials and ensuring he is heavily medicated so the transfer goes smoothly. You are dismissed." I walked out of the study feeling as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the mansion. 48 hours. The timeline had just collapsed entirely. I waited until 1 o'clock in the morning, navigating the blind spots of the security cameras to slip silently into Adrian's suite. I found him standing by the massive window, staring out at the pitch-black ocean. When I told him about the Colorado facility, his posture went entirely rigid. The fight seemed to instantly drain out of his hollowed face. "Colorado," Adrian breathed out, leaning his forehead heavily against the cold glass. "That is the absolute end of the line. Moving me across state lines intentionally severs the jurisdiction of the local courts where my original corporate filings are held. A private, isolated facility means no neutral staff, no Elias to help us, and no access to the unredacted medical ledgers. Once they put me on that plane, I will never legally exist again. They will lock me in a permanent chemical coma until my heart eventually gives out." I looked at the man who was staring down the barrel of his own systematic erasure, and my mind shifted into a state of absolute, icy clarity. We were completely out of time for careful data collection. We were standing on the edge of a cliff, and Daniel was actively pushing us over. I made a concrete, dangerous decision. I had to completely alter the dynamic of the battlefield. I had to become exactly what Daniel and Vivian needed me to be: a completely broken, submissive casualty. I had to feed their massive arrogance. If they suspected for even a fraction of a second that I was quietly assembling a counterattack, they would fire me and drag Adrian away before the sun even came up. I needed to buy us the final 48 hours. The next morning, my physical and psychological transformation was absolute. I entirely stopped walking with my shoulders pulled back. I deliberately kept my eyes glued to the expensive floorboards whenever Vivian or Daniel passed by me in the hallways. When I served Adrian his meals in the heavy presence of the security detail, I made absolutely sure my hands shook noticeably. I actively avoided making any eye contact with him. I shrank myself down into the dull gray fabric of my staff uniform, radiating a palpable aura of pure, unadulterated defeat, to completely solidify their false sense of ultimate security. Adrian and I quietly coordinated a masterpiece of chaotic theater. During the mid-afternoon vital check, right when we both knew Vivian was walking down the East Wing corridor toward her private quarters, Adrian unleashed a terrifying, guttural scream. It echoed horribly through the stone walls. As I stood by the door, he violently swept his heavy oak reading desk completely clean. Heavy brass lamps, thick hardcover books, and a massive glass water pitcher went flying across the room, smashing violently against the far wall. By the time Vivian and two massive security guards shoved open the heavy oak door, the room was a war zone. Adrian was huddled in the far corner of the room, clutching his head, rocking violently, and muttering incoherent, frantic nonsense. I was on my hands and knees right in the center of the room, directly in the middle of the jagged shards of broken glass and spilled water. I looked up at Vivian as she stepped into the room, my eyes wide and swimming with perfectly manufactured, desperate tears. "I do not know what happened," I stammered, my voice cracking pathetically, letting my whole body tremble. "I just tried to give him his water pill. He just snapped. I am so sorry. Please, Miss Vale, please do not let me go. I will clean it up immediately. I desperately need this job." Vivian looked down at me, her expression twisting into a mask of absolute, aristocratic disgust. But far more importantly, beneath the disgust, I saw absolute trust in my utter weakness. She saw exactly what she desperately wanted to see: a shattered, pathetic woman who had finally learned her place at the bottom of the food chain. "Have the guards secure him to the bed," Vivian ordered coldly, turning her back on the chaos. "And clean up this pathetic mess. Kylie, do not make me regret keeping you on the payroll." As the heavy door clicked shut behind her, leaving me alone on the wet floor while the guards dragged Adrian away, the desperate tears on my cheeks instantly dried. My breathing slowed. My hands entirely stopped shaking. A sharp piece of broken glass dug painfully into my palm. But I did not care. In the suffocating, arrogant darkness of their massive underestimation, I finally had the quiet breathing room I desperately needed. They thought I was securely trapped on the floor, weeping over broken glass. They had no idea I was quietly loading the weapon that was going to blow their entire stolen empire to pieces. The encrypted physical drive was wrapped in a greasy mechanic's rag. Elias had silently slipped it into my apron pocket during the morning garden rotation. It was an emergency localized backup server that Adrian had manually hidden inside the unused pool house pump room over 14 months ago, just weeks before his highly suspicious boating accident. Vivian's private security team had thoroughly swept the main house and wiped all the primary corporate servers, but they had completely ignored the dusty, chlorine-scented maintenance sheds. At exactly 2 a.m, sitting on the cold tile floor of my locked bathroom, I connected the heavy metal drive to an untraceable burner tablet Elias had purchased with cash from a local electronics store. I bypassed the outdated security firewall using a basic administrative override I had learned during my first year at Northline Risk Systems. The screen flooded with thousands of archived emails, deeply buried financial projections, and confidential internal memorandums. I bypassed the corporate jargon and immediately ran a global search query for Daniel's name. I fully expected to find communication from the past 10 months, detailing the immediate aftermath of Adrian's brain injury and the execution of the guardianship protocols. Instead, the search results populated with dozens of highly encrypted message threads dating back 36 months. 3 entire years ago. My breath caught sharply in my throat. My fingers hovered over the cracked glass of the tablet. Daniel and I were still happily married 3 years ago. We were actively trying for a second child. We were hosting Sunday dinners for our neighbors. I opened the oldest thread. It was a direct exchange between Daniel and Vivian's senior executive assistant. The emails clearly proved Daniel did not accidentally cross paths with the Vale family after my marriage dissolved. He had actively hunted them. He had recognized the early, quiet rumors of a massive power struggle brewing within Vale Meridian, and he had proactively offered his specialized services to Vivian's camp as a corporate mercenary. But it was the 5th email in the chain that entirely stopped my heart from beating. Vivian's assistant had expressed severe doubts regarding Daniel's ability to completely restructure the company's liability protocols without drawing the attention of federal risk auditors. Daniel had replied with a chilling, supreme arrogance to guarantee his ultimate success. "You do not need to worry about the compliance architecture," Daniel had written, his words glowing a harsh, toxic white against the dark screen. "I have unlimited access to the exact blueprints we need. Yeah, my wife is a senior specialist in this exact field. She is gifted with systems, brilliant with records, and far too decent to ever imagine that other people are as dirty as we are. I am pulling her structural templates every single night. I have all the assets we require." The small, sterile bathroom began to violently spin. I dropped the tablet onto the bath mat as if the glass had suddenly caught fire. The physical pain that ripped through my chest was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was not the sharp, hot sting of a sudden betrayal. It was a profound, suffocating collapse of my entire fundamental reality. Every single memory I held from the last 3 years of my marriage instantly turned to ash. When Daniel used to ask me about my day over a glass of red wine, leaning across our kitchen island with that warm, supportive smile, he was not being a loving husband. He was conducting active espionage. When he gently rubbed my shoulders while I complained about the complex medical indemnification frameworks I was building for the hospital networks, he was quietly taking mental notes. I was never his partner. I was his completely blind, unpaid consultant. He had actively turned my unwavering trust, my professional brilliance, and my fundamental decency into the exact weapons he used to destroy another human being, and ultimately, to destroy me. 11 years of shared history completely evaporated in the span of 30 seconds. It was not a failed romance. It was a cold, calculated, decade-long corporate investment, and I was just a heavily exploited asset that he finally liquidated when my utility expired. I pressed my hands hard against my face, my lungs gasping for air as a silent, agonizing sob tore its way up my throat. I felt entirely hollowed out, stripped down to nothing but raw, bleeding nerve endings. The urge to pack my single suitcase, wake my daughter up, and run as fast and as far away from Rhode Island as possible was overwhelmingly powerful. I wanted to surrender to the darkness Daniel had built for me. A quiet, heavy knock on the bathroom door broke the suffocating silence. I quickly wiped my face, my hands trembling violently, and opened the door a few inches. Adrian stood in the shadowed hallway. The nightly sedative I had flushed down the sink hours ago left him entirely lucid, and his dark eyes immediately registered the absolute devastation written across my pale face. He stepped inside and quietly pushed the door shut behind him. He looked down at the glowing tablet resting on the floor, reading the open email thread. He did not offer me a pathetic, useless apology. He did not try to softly comfort me or tell me that time would heal the massive wound in my chest. "He turned your entire life into a strategic acquisition," Adrian stated, his voice flat, analytical, and entirely stripped of pity. "He used my own brain to build your prison," I whispered. the words tasting like copper and poison. He sat at my dinner table, kissed my forehead, and stole my systems. I thought my marriage failed because we drifted apart. But he was just extracting data. I am completely empty. Adrian, I have absolutely nothing left to fight with. Adrian reached down, picked up the burner tablet, and handed it directly back to me. His gaze was incredibly intense, burning with a cold, unforgiving fire. If you walk out those front gates tonight, Daniel wins exactly twice, Adrian said, his tone striking the air like a heavy iron hammer. He wins the personal game by leaving you permanently broken, terrified, and convinced you are entirely worthless. And he wins the corporate game by successfully burying me under your stolen paperwork. He gets to keep your dignity, and he gets to keep my empire. I stared at the tablet in my hands. The crushing, paralyzing grief slowly began to recede, leaving a massive, echoing vacuum behind. And then, drop by drop, that empty space began to fill with something entirely different. It was not sadness. It was a pure, highly concentrated, freezing rage. Adrian was absolutely right. The man who wrote that email did not deserve my tears. He deserved my absolute destruction. He thinks my decency makes me weak, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm whisper. The violent trembling in my hands completely stopped. He thinks because I build systems to protect people, I do not know how to violently dismantle them. Can you dismantle this one? Adrian asked, testing the strength of the new foundation forming beneath my feet. I built the architecture, I replied, meeting his intense gaze with a sudden, razor-sharp clarity. I know exactly where every single load-bearing pillar is buried, but we have to change the strategy completely. We cannot walk into that medical board hearing tomorrow and try to convince them you are a flawless, innocent man who was tragically wronged. Vivian has the lab error from 5 years ago locked and loaded. If we try to play defense, she will use your past corporate sins to justify your current confinement. Adrian nodded slowly, fully understanding the brutal mathematics of the situation. So what is the play? We do not defend you at all, I stated, the blueprint forming flawlessly in my mind. We attack the integrity of the containment protocol itself. We stop fighting the narrative of the madman, and we shine a massive, blinding spotlight on the exact tools they use to chain him to the floor. We prove the heavily forged pharmaceutical supply chains. We prove the illegal transfer of funds through Daniel's shell companies. We expose the aggressive chemical manipulation. We use the absolute truth, not to clear your name, but to completely sever their legal authority to hold you. For the first time since I stepped foot inside Ashmore Point, I saw a genuine, dangerous smile touch the corner of Adrian's mouth. It was the exact moment the entire dynamic of my reality shifted permanently. I was no longer a desperate mother fighting simply to survive the month. I was no longer the humiliated, discarded ex-wife hiding in the shadows of a coastal mansion. I was a professional risk assessor who had just identified a massive, catastrophic vulnerability in her enemy's defensive line. I did not want to scream. I did not want to cry. I wanted to take the sharp, ugly truth of Daniel's arrogance and slide it directly between his ribs right when he believed he had won everything. The game of survival was officially over. The execution had just begun. The atmosphere inside Ashmore Point that evening was suffocatingly thick, practically vibrating with the dark energy of a premeditated execution. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy iron gates parted to admit 3 sleek black sedans. Vivian had orchestrated a morbid, highly calculated pre-victory dinner. The guest list was small, but devastatingly powerful, the lead corporate attorney for Vale Meridian, a highly paid independent psychiatrist brought in specifically for the final evaluation, and 2 notably pliable members of the Vale Family Trust Board. They sat in the cavernous formal dining room, the soft clinking of expensive crystal echoing against the stone walls as they confidently toasted to the imminent transfer of absolute guardianship scheduled for 8 o'clock the following morning. I needed to inject chaos into their perfectly structured evening. I needed Daniel out of the main house and far away from his secure laptop. During the dinner service, I cornered a young, easily manipulated kitchen assistant named Maria in the butler's pantry. I knew perfectly well that Maria funneled staff gossip directly to the head of security for extra cash. I manufactured a look of deep, terrified anxiety. I leaned in and whispered that Adrian had been having a manic episode earlier that afternoon, frantically muttering about a hidden trust deed for an old coastal marina. I told her he kept repeating that the physical documents were stuffed inside the false bottom of the main irrigation control box out in the western greenhouse. It was a completely fabricated asset, a phantom piece of leverage. But Daniel was a man driven by insatiable greed. He was far too arrogant to leave a potential fortune lying in the dirt, while the dinner guests migrated to the drawing room for their after-dinner brandy. I slipped down into the damp, concrete basement. Using the administrative backdoor protocol I had established on the burner tablet the previous night, I accessed the estate's localized voice-over internet protocol server. My fingers flew across the glass screen in the dark. I pulled the temporary audio cache from the dedicated phone line in Daniel's private office. My heart hammered against my ribs as I found an outgoing call logged at 4 o'clock that very afternoon. I pressed play, holding the tablet pressed tightly against my ear. Daniel's voice filtered through the speaker, crisp, commanding, and laced with absolute malice. He was speaking to the independent psychiatrist currently drinking Vivian's expensive liquor upstairs. "You need to use much more definitive language in your final written assessment," Daniel demanded on the recording, his tone dropping into a hard threat. "You cannot just say he is experiencing cognitive decline. You must explicitly state that he is an immediate, violent danger to himself and others. Do not leave any ambiguous medical loopholes for his former lawyers to exploit, or I will personally ensure your private medical practice loses its primary hospital network contract by the end of the week." It was the smoking gun. It was a recorded, undeniable instance of direct witness tampering and medical extortion. I quickly downloaded the audio file to the encrypted flash drive Elias had provided. At exactly midnight, the second phase of the trap snapped shut. I stood in the shadowed alcove near the kitchen, watching the live feed on my tablet. Elias had brilliantly rewired a decommissioned, forgotten analog camera hidden high above the exotic orchids in the greenhouse. The grainy, green-tinted night vision feed flickered to life. Seconds later, the heavy glass door of the conservatory clicked open. Daniel stepped into the frame. He had abandoned his tailored suit jacket, wearing only a dark sweater, and he was carrying a heavy iron pry bar he must have taken from the garage. He marched with aggressive purpose straight toward the main irrigation control box. I watched, barely daring to breathe, as the man who had meticulously destroyed my life violently jammed the iron bar into the seam of the metal panel and ripped it off the wall. He began frantically digging through the wiring, completely unaware that his desperate, highly illegal destruction of estate property was being recorded in undeniable high definition. I had him. I had the audio, the video, the financial records, and the stolen structural templates. The victory tasted sharp and metallic in my mouth. My triumph lasted exactly 5 minutes. As I turned to walk back toward the east wing to silently signal Adrian that the evidence was secure, the mansion's interior security alarm suddenly blared to life. It was a harsh, deafening two-tone warning that made my blood run instantly cold. Vivian's voice echoed over the overhead intercom system, completely devoid of her usual aristocratic, icy calm. She sounded genuinely furious. "Initiate a full perimeter lockdown immediately," Vivian commanded over the speakers. "The master override key for the medical dispensary is missing from my desk. Nobody leaves this house. Security personnel, begin a systematic search of the staff quarters immediately. Start with the caretaker's room." The floor seemed to vanish from beneath my feet. I had used that master key earlier in the day to cross-reference the final batch numbers, and in my rush to avoid Daniel in the hallway, I must have failed to return it to its exact position on her desk. The encrypted flash drive containing every single piece of explosive evidence was sitting heavily in my apron pocket. I was trapped in the long, narrow corridor connecting the kitchen to the grand hall. Through the archway, I could see 2 massive security guards already sprinting toward the staff wing where my bedroom was located. If they patted me down, if they found the drive, Daniel would completely destroy the data within seconds, and Adrian would be chemically lobotomized by noon tomorrow. Everything we had sacrificed would burn to ash. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the top of the grand staircase swung violently open. Adrian stepped out onto the landing. He was being escorted back to his suite by a night nurse. He looked down into the corridor and locked eyes with me. He saw the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from my rigid posture. He saw my hand instinctively clutch my apron pocket. He understood the catastrophic failure of the moment instantly. He did not hesitate. He did not just act like a disturbed patient. He unleashed a terrifying, primal violence that I had never witnessed before, a performance of pure, desperate sacrifice. With a deafening, blood-curdling roar that tore his vocal cords, Adrian lunged forward. He grabbed the heavy, antique wooden chair positioned on the landing and hurled it with devastating, terrifying force directly into the massive crystal chandelier hanging suspended over the grand foyer. The impact was explosive. Thousands of jagged, glittering shards of broken crystal rained down upon the marble floor like a deadly hailstorm. The sound was deafening. "Get them out of my head!" Adrian screamed at the top of his lungs, violently tearing his expensive cashmere sweater right down the center. He gripped the sturdy oak handrail tightly, pacing frantically, appearing as though he were entirely overwhelmed by the vast two-story expanse stretching down to the marble floor beneath him. The sheer sudden chaos of his actions completely shattered the security protocol. "Code red on the main landing!" the night nurse shrieked in absolute terror. Every single security guard in the vicinity, including the two men who were seconds away from searching my room, abruptly reversed direction. They abandoned the hunt for the missing key and sprinted frantically toward the grand staircase to tackle the raging, out-of-control billionaire before he could kill himself. I used the magnificent distraction to move. I ran in the opposite direction, my shoes completely silent on the rugs, and slipped through the heavy side doors into the pitch-black greenhouse. The humid air hit my face like a wet blanket. I sprinted toward the massive plastic tub of granulated koi fish food sitting near the decorative pond. I plunged my arm deep into the foul-smelling pellets, burying the encrypted flash drive at the absolute bottom. Elias materialized from the shadows near the exterior service door, holding a heavy canvas bag. I quickly pulled the folded physical copies of the forged medical ledgers from the inside lining of my jacket and shoved them into his calloused hands. "Get these entirely off the property," I breathed, my chest heaving. "Do not bring them back until the hearing begins." Elias nodded once, his face grim, and vanished silently into the dark coastal night. By the time I slowly walked back into the grand hall, playing the part of a terrified, confused servant, it was taking 4 grown men to successfully pin Adrian face down onto the marble floor. He was breathing heavily, surrounded by the glittering ruin of the shattered chandelier. Vivian stood at the top of the stairs, her face pale but her pale eyes gleaming with a dark, absolute, vindicated triumph. The visiting doctor was standing behind her, rapidly taking notes on his legal pad, deeply horrified and completely convinced by the violent display he had just witnessed. Vivian looked down at me standing near the archway, her expression practically vibrating with pure, aristocratic disgust. "You are completely useless, Kylie," Vivian stated, her voice carrying clearly over the heavy breathing of the guards. "Look at this catastrophic failure of care. You could not even keep him contained on the eve of his transfer. You are officially suspended from all duties pending tomorrow's medical hearing. Get out of my sight and stay in your room." I bowed my head, letting my shoulders slump heavily, playing the role of the weeping, thoroughly defeated caretaker one final time. I turned around and began the long walk back to the staff quarters. As I passed the heavy glass doors of the library, I glanced sideways into the room. Daniel was standing by the massive stone fireplace, casually swirling a crystal glass of amber whiskey. He was looking out at the chaos in the hall, and he was smiling. It was a wide, deeply arrogant, entirely satisfied smile. He thought he had engineered the perfect, airtight victory, He thought he had successfully broken his ex-wife, manipulated the medical board, and permanently buried his rival. He was celebrating his brilliance. But as I walked away into the dark, my heart beat with a steady, lethal, unstoppable rhythm. I did not feel defeated. I felt dangerous, because I knew a fundamental, undeniable truth about men like Daniel Mercer. They never look for the knife in the dark. They always lose the absolute hardest at the exact moment they firmly believe they have completely won. At exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, the massive glass conservatory at Ashmore Point was transformed into a cold, brightly lit corporate execution chamber. The morning sun poured through the skylights, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. But the atmosphere around the long mahogany table was entirely suffocating. Vivian stood at the head of the table, looking like a conquering queen in a sharp black suit. Seated around her were the 3 senior members of the Vale Family Trust Board, the estate's lead corporate attorney, and the independent psychiatrist Daniel had aggressively threatened the day before. Adrian sat at the far end of the table, flanked by 2 heavy security guards. He was slumped forward, staring blankly at the polished wood, playing his final role to absolute perfection. "Gentlemen, we are here to formalize a tragedy," Vivian began, her voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. Despite our exhaustive efforts and unlimited financial resources, Adrian's cognitive decline has become violently unmanageable. The incident in the Grand Hall last night proved he's completely incapable of regulating his own behavior, let alone directing a billion-dollar biotechnology firm. The psychiatrist nodded gravely, sliding a thick stack of printed documents toward the board members. "These are the heavily documented behavioral logs, completely verified by the nursing staff. They show a highly consistent, terrifying escalation of paranoid schizophrenia and violent dementia." Vivian then turned her cold, pale eyes toward the corner of the room where I stood quietly in my gray uniform. "Furthermore," Vivian stated smoothly, "we have discovered a deeply troubling lack of professionalism within his immediate care team. I have asked my senior strategic advisor to provide context regarding our lead caretaker." Daniel stood up from his leather chair. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, offering the board members a deeply sympathetic, regretful smile. He looked directly at me, and I could see the absolute thrill of the kill shining in his dark eyes. "I must apologize to the board," Daniel said smoothly. "I personally recommended Miss Barnes for this position. Unfortunately, my judgment was clouded by pity. Miss Barnes is my former wife. We finalized our divorce a few months ago. She is currently drowning in tens of thousands of dollars of consumer debt, living in her mother's cramped house, and suffering from severe emotional instability. She is a deeply scorned, bitter woman who has allowed her personal financial panic to completely compromise her professional duties in this house." The board members exchanged uncomfortable, disapproving glances. Daniel had effectively painted me as a pathetic, hysterical liability. He thought he had completely neutralized my voice before I could even open my mouth. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold weight of the encrypted tablet in my apron pocket. I did not shrink back into the shadows. I stepped directly into the center of the sunlight hitting the floor. I did not yell, and I did not cry. My voice was perfectly level, carrying the sharp, undeniable authority of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "Every single personal failing Daniel just listed is completely accurate," I stated calmly, looking directly into the eyes of the eldest board member. "I am entirely bankrupt. I was betrayed by my husband of 11 years, and my daughter is currently sleeping on a borrowed twin mattress. But desperation did not make me a liar. But greed made those two create a fake madman." The entire room went dead silent. Daniel's confident smile instantly froze, before Vivian could command the security guards to physically remove me. The heavy glass doors of the conservatory swung open. Elias walked into the room. He bypassed the guards completely and slammed the genuine, heavy medical ledger onto the mahogany table right in front of the board members. "That is the actual medication log, retrieved directly from the head nurse's biometric safe," I said, stepping closer to the table. "You will notice the dosage of highly restricted chemical sedatives triples exactly on the days any independent auditor or legal counsel visits this estate, they are not managing an illness. They are actively inducing a chemical lobotomy. I pulled the tablet from my pocket and placed it on the table. I tapped the screen once. Daniel's own voice echoed loudly through the silent conservatory, playing the audio file I had extracted from the basement server. The board members listened in absolute horror as Daniel explicitly threatened the independent psychiatrist, demanding he falsify the medical evaluation or lose his primary hospital contracts. The psychiatrist went completely pale, his hands shaking violently as he dropped his pen. "That audio is deeply fabricated," Daniel shouted, the panic finally breaking through his polished veneer. He stepped forward, his face flushing dark red. "She is a desperate, vindictive liar trying to extort this family. I am a senior risk review specialist," I fired back, my voice slicing through his pathetic defense like a razor blade. "And you are a remarkably lazy thief." I swiped the screen of the tablet, projecting a high-definition image of the forged medical intake forms Vivian had submitted to the state court. If the board's legal counsel checks the digital metadata on those specific indemnification clauses, they will find the exact structural templates I personally authored for Northline Risk Systems 3 years ago, I explained, staring directly into Daniel's terrified eyes. Daniel stole my intellectual property from our home network and used it to build this fraudulent medical prison. And if you need further proof of his criminal intent, here is the security footage from exactly midnight last night. The video played on the screen, showing Daniel violently destroying the irrigation box with an iron pry bar, desperately hunting for hidden assets. The room erupted into absolute chaos. The lead corporate attorney immediately stood up, shouting for order, while the board members stared at Vivian in pure, unadulterated disgust. Vivian lost her iron grip on her composure. Her face twisted into a mask of feral desperation. She slammed her hands flat against the table and pointed a trembling finger directly at Adrian. "You are listening to a bitter maid," Vivian screamed at the board. "Adrian is a criminal 5 years ago. He deliberately suppressed a catastrophic laboratory failure regarding the primary clinical trials. He committed federal fraud to protect the public offering. If you remove my guardianship, he will destroy the entire company." The room fell entirely silent again. It was her ultimate trump card, the blackmail she had used to force Adrian into submission before the yacht accident ever happened. Adrian slowly pushed his chair back. The slumped, vacant posture completely vanished. He stood up to his full, imposing height. He looked nothing like a broken patient. He looked exactly like the brilliant, ruthless founder of Vale Meridian. "She is absolutely right," Adrian said, his voice ringing with perfect, chilling clarity. 5 years ago, I made a highly illegal, morally bankrupt decision to protect the corporate stock price. I hid the data. I am fully prepared to face the federal authorities, step down from the board, and accept the legal consequences of my actions. But my past sins do not give you the right to poison my blood, steal my mind, and bury me alive in my own home. His absolute, unflinching honesty instantly stripped Vivian of her only weapon. The board realized they were not looking at a lunatic. They were looking at a deeply flawed but entirely lucid man who had been violently tortured by his own family. Adrian reached into his pocket, pulled out his own cell phone, and pressed a single button. "I just activated the emergency archive protocol we built last night," Adrian announced to the silent room. Every single piece of evidence, the audio recordings, the stolen structural metadata, the offshore shell company registrations Daniel used to purchase the illegal sedatives, and my own full confession regarding the clinical trials, has just been securely transmitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Fraud Investigation Bureau, and the Independent Corporate Oversight Committee. Daniel did not say a single word. He turned around and sprinted frantically toward the glass doors, desperate to reach his car and escape the estate before the local authorities arrived. He barely made it past the fountain in the driveway. The very same massive security guards he had paid to keep Adrian locked inside the house violently tackled Daniel to the gravel, pinning his arms behind his back as they realized who was truly writing their paychecks. Inside the conservatory, Vivian collapsed into her chair. Her perfect composure was entirely shattered. She buried her face in her hands, screaming hysterically that I had ruined her magnificent future, completely oblivious to the fact that her own monstrous greed had dug her grave. The board's attorney immediately informed her that she was permanently suspended from all corporate duties and legally barred from accessing a single penny of the family trust. 2 weeks later, I stood in the bright, busy lobby of the newly restructured Vale Meridian Renewal Office in downtown Providence. The heavy, suffocating darkness of Ashmore Point felt like a distant nightmare. Adrian walked out of his corner office to meet me. He looked entirely different. The bruising was gone. His hands were steady, and he wore a sharp suit. He did not offer me a ridiculous fairy tale romance or a gratuitous, unearned massive fortune. He offered me a partnership forged in absolute hell. The legal department confirmed the wire transfers cleared this morning, Adrian told me, handing me a thick sealed folder. Every single cent of the fraudulent debt Daniel strapped to your name has been completely eradicated. His personal assets were seized by the federal authorities yesterday. Furthermore, the private educational trust fund for Lena is fully capitalized and legally untouchable. I opened the folder. Inside was not just the proof of my financial freedom, but a highly lucrative, ironclad employment contract. We need a director to run the new corporate ethics and internal control department, Adrian said, a genuine smile reaching his eyes. I cannot think of anyone more qualified to identify a rotten system and tear it down than the woman who dismantled mine. I looked at the contract, and then I looked at the man who had helped me burn my nightmares to the ground. I signed my name on the dotted line. I did not accept the position because I needed a billionaire to save me. I accepted it because, for the first time since my husband walked out the door, I was stepping into my own absolute power. I walked out of that coastal mansion with my life, my daughter, and my honor entirely intact, while the man who tried to bury me was left rotting in a federal cell with absolutely nothing. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support the channel even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.